Hi, my name is Sean Adams. I'm a junior majoring in global security studies here at Middlebury. I am so happy to welcome you to an episode in our series, MIDDVantage, Exploring Careers in Conflict Transformation. During the series, you'll be hearing from members of the Middlebury community who work in and around the field of conflict transformation. Today, I'm joined by Theo Dolan, class of '94. He serves as the global lead for innovation in countering disinformation with the International Research and Exchanges Board, or IREX for short, a nonprofit organization dedicated to global education and development. Theo, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Sean. Looking forward to speaking with you.
So I would like to start off by talking about the work you do with IREX and your career space more generally, getting a little bit into how it might fit into this framework of conflict transformation. So what does IREX do? Whom does it serve? And how do its approaches vary from other organizations in the development and global education space?
Sure. So IREX is an international development NGO. We're a nonprofit. We're based in Washington, D.C. We work with partners in more than 100 countries in 4 areas: empowering youth, cultivating leaders, strengthening institutions, and extending access to quality education and information. So I work in a strategic role, as I'll describe, attempting to build out our media literacy and digital resilience work through our Learn to Discern approach.
That's perfect. And now that you've spoken a little bit to what IREX does as a whole, as an organization, I wanted to, as you mentioned, pivot to some of the work that you do more specifically as the global lead for countering disinformation and some of the challenges that you face. Can you briefly go over your role in the organization and the kind of projects your team undertakes, both long-term and on a daily basis?
Sure. So I work in a strategic role. I'm the global lead for innovation and countering disinformation, which is a somewhat awkward title, but just to say that I work with colleagues across IREX, including internationally, to develop new ways of expanding and scaling our work on media literacy and digital resilience. So we have an approach called Learn to Discern, which started as a media literacy curriculum in Ukraine back in 2015, and has since expanded into a wide range of approaches, including we've developed some online learning platforms called Very Verified, which are being implemented in 6 to 8 countries. We do peer-to-peer workshops in places like Serbia to raise awareness about digital threats and to impart media literacy skills. We work through formal and informal school systems, like in Ukraine, where we're working in 1,300 schools to infuse a wide range of subjects with a media literacy curriculum. And we've even experimented with online games, like in Indonesia. We partnered with a company called Moonshot to develop the Gali Fakta game. So I'm looking at innovative ways to expand on this work and to reach new audiences. And that includes technology, that includes new partnerships, right, and that includes working through government organizations to secure funding.
Gotcha. So next, I wanted to have a conversation about the topic of disinformation, which you work with, a buzzword that has been on the minds of many in light of its popular and repeated use in recent years, not to mention its implication on society's ability to agree on some basic facts. I wanted to try and link disinformation to the focus of this series, which is conflict transformation. So in J.P. Lederach's short book, The Little Book of Conflict Transformation, he writes that, quote, "To encourage the positive potential inherent in conflict, we must concentrate on the less visible dimensions of relationships, rather than concentrating exclusively on the content and substances of fighting that is often more visible," end quote. So in an attempt to apply this particular facet of conflict transformation and coming from the perspective of a global education organization, what would you consider one of the less visible aspects of disinformation, something that maybe people should pay more attention to or misunderstand altogether about the term disinformation, including that conflation with misinformation, which a lot of people think they're the same thing. So that'd be great if you could speak to that.
Right. Well, first of all, at IREX, we tend to group a lot of the digital threats under the umbrella of manipulative information. So that includes mis and disinformation, malinformation, hate speech, cyberbullying, sextorting, all different types of manipulative information that exist. And there are new versions appearing almost every day. We group it under the framework of manipulative information. So I would say that no part of our society, no area, no technical area, from public health to governance to economic development, is immune from manipulative information. We're all subject to it, and we've all been victimized by it. Think of your own experience on social media, for example. I'm sure you've seen attacks come your way for various purposes, but we're all subject to this, and it's as we've seen with COVID-19, it's cut across public health. Media literacy as a term has been politicized and criticized, where in fact it's a very apolitical term. So we've seen it emerge in all kinds of ways, and there's no off-the-shelf solution to addressing it. So what we do at IREX is we try to work at different levels of society, from the individual level to the community level to the institutional level, through our programs. And this is called a whole of society approach, which is a bit of a buzzword, but all that means is working at different levels of society to address the problem. So for example, working with schools, in any country, working in the formal and informal school systems is really important for media literacy and for building digital resilience to manipulative information. You've got to work at the community level. Peers are often the most effective at imparting knowledge and changing attitudes for their peers. So you've got to work at that level, and you've got to work at the individual level. For example, social media inoculation campaigns to help people understand the psychosocial aspects of why they're being why they're vulnerable to manipulative information in the first place. So we work at all those levels. And to the quote about the Lederach book, I think for me, I've worked in peacebuilding for about 20 years at the intersection of media, technology, and peacebuilding. And honestly, no single actor, no single stakeholder is responsible for conflict transformation. It takes relationships, often from the bottom up, to be able to broker change. And that takes a lot of trust building, a lot of relationship building, but it's almost never, to be successful, it's almost never a top-down process. It's almost always bottom up. And I think that to me is the essence of the quote that you just provided.
Perfect. Yes. I'll ask another question on the sort of bottom-up relationships that you build with communities on the ground in just a little bit. But first, to stay on the topic of disinformation and the work that you do for IREX, it seems, at least to me, that the internet, being both a tool for education and an environment with a high propensity for the spread of disinformation, presents both challenges and plus advantages in reaching the overarching aims of your organization. Do you find the digital space one of the most challenging fronts to tackle disinformation? And then do you expect it to improve? And finally, what role can technology play in ensuring that things do move in the right direction?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Sean. I mean, I think there are some who say that social media is just a tool. And so it's about putting the right tools in the right hands to build peace, for example, and to address these sort of threats. But I think the digital arena is really the key forum that we're talking about when we talk about manipulative information, simply because research shows, for example, that disinformation spreads significantly faster than factual information. And that's because of the way the technology is designed. It's designed to be addictive. It's designed to channel information to you based on your preferences and your usage. and it capitalizes on how our brains work in the first place. So, we're inclined to, for example, we gravitate to information that we already know and like, so that's where, for example, our work starts, is with the recognition that before you get to the technical skills of, say, fact checking and verification, you have to address the brain science behind disinformation.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so how do you think organizations like IREX can train educators to recognize and adapt to these new and evolving dangers that you described that are presented by disinformation on the internet, especially in a country where the sources of information might be more regulated by governments, or even conversely not regulated at all, or have super loose regulations, as is the case in the United States? So, how is disinformation combated in these different national environments?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would say there are three main areas that we work in with our Learn to Discern approach. And starting at the sort of back end of that, I mentioned the technical skills like fact checking and image verification and all that. That's extremely important. And you've got to have those skills. We also work a lot with imparting information and about what is factual information, the difference between, fact-based reporting and opinion, and understanding where you can go for factual information and how you can take control of your information environment. That's all very important. But as I said, we start with the psychosocial aspects of human reaction and its emotional reaction to how we consume information. And so Learn to Discern, in fact, teaches how to consume information, not what information to consume. Mm-hmm. So for example, say you see a tweet that is egregiously hateful, right? And you have this initial emotional reaction to that, right? And you may, for example, react in a way that if you had a moment to reflect on the content of the tweet, you would react differently, right? You would engage your executive brain to say, aha, this is hateful, but I need to have a different reaction to this beyond just the knee-jerk reaction. So those are the types of exercises. We call that name it to tame it, for example. This is based on an academic named Dr. Dan Siegel, and we've adapted his technique of name it to tame it. So you name that emotional reaction you have, you take a moment to reflect on why you're having that emotion, and that gives you the cognitive ability to be able to react in a more rational way and to apply critical thinking. So that's really the core of our work, in addition to the other two areas that I mentioned.
So I remember when a group of us spoke to you last summer at FHI 360, you emphasized the importance of being intentional about working directly with partners abroad, in some of maybe the curriculum ways which you described. So like really listening to their concerns in order to gauge what they really need, not what some outside entity deems is necessary.
That's right.
So as you have transitioned to doing some different work at IREX, do you still see this idea, as I mentioned before, of a bottom-up needs assessment as a relevant part of your job? And if so, how do you and your team go about ensuring that the people whose lives are being affected by the work of your organization are part of the conversation? And I was wondering if you could maybe give us an example of such an interaction that you have on a regular basis with someone in a different place that you're working with.
Right. Well, I think I mentioned, no approach to combating disinformation can be an off-the-shelf approach, because context is so critical. The language and the means of dissemination, the people spreading disinformation, the audiences, they're constantly shifting. So the local context is critical, which means that you have to work with local partners to understand that context. That's critical. And constant adaptation is needed, and that takes time and effort, obviously, and often resources, right? Along those lines, in one of my previous jobs working for an offshoot of the US Institute of Peace called Peace Tech Lab, we developed a research methodology to create a lexicon of hate speech terminology. This started back in 2016 in South Sudan. And so what this did was this contextualized a lot of the online hate language that we were seeing by working in South Sudan and working with local partners there. And so the research methodology contextualized hate speech to help people understand in which context it was considered hateful, who was being targeted, what are different variations of those terms, and when it was considered not hateful, right? Which is equally important. And so that then allowed our partners to be able to monitor social media for those terms and design training and other interventions to help combat the actual hate speech that was taking place online and offline.
Right. And that last part of the question, so what kind of people do you interact with on a daily basis as part of the projects that you work on? And how do they play a role in the process?
Well, so at IREX, we implement Learn to Discern in 20 countries. As I said, it started in Ukraine in 2015, but now basically I coordinate with our country offices working in this space to understand what's working for them. You know, how are they reaching audiences through Learn to Discern approaches? Which method of delivery, be it a game or an online platform or peer-to-peer workshops, what's working the best? Because we have to gather our learning and be able to adapt. Because as I said, things are changing. It's a very fluid space. And so that's a big part of my job, is understanding where we're having impact and where we're not.
Very interesting, Theo. Thank you for sharing these insights. So let's backtrack a bit. I'm curious about your own experience from campus to career. So at Mid, you majored in political science and German. Tell us the rest of your story from there.
Well, I knew two things going to Middlebury. I knew I wanted to spend a year abroad, and I knew I wanted to swim. And I did both. But I didn't really have a plan, and I think that's okay at a liberal arts college. But I spent a year in Germany. I had a joint German political science major, and I wish I had other major opportunities like conflict transformation. That would have been brilliant. But our options were more limited in the 90s, as you can imagine. So these options that Middlebury students now have, I hope students are taking full advantage of them. But basically, after Middlebury, I tried to get a job in the international space, and I didn't fully know what that entailed until I got to graduate school. I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and at that time I had two internships in DC, one at the National Democratic Institute and another at a international business intelligence group run by a former commerce secretary. And those really switched me on to the whole international development arena, especially the internship at the National Democratic Institute, where I was working on democratic governance programs in Central and Eastern Europe. And at that time, it was a very fascinating space to be in, following the wars in the Balkans. And that really clued me into the international development arena, as I said, and 20 years later, here I am.
Gotcha. So it sounds like some of your experience at grad school and once you started getting on the ground in those internships, especially with some of the geopolitical events that were going on in the Balkans, shaped, what you decided that you were going to do.
Yeah, and just to connect the dots a little bit more, after those internships, I worked for 2 years at a technology research company in Boston. And then I returned back to DC just after 9/11. Interestingly, I was living a half mile away from the Pentagon when 9/11 happened, and that was a very sort of personally moving moment for me returning to DC at that time. But But then I worked at IREX for 5 years back in the early 2000s for the first time. So I'm actually returning to IREX. I was a program officer working on the media development division, working to strengthen independent media in the Balkans. As you know, they had just experienced war. The media sector was struggling. And so I got to travel all through the Balkans at that time, Albania, Bulgaria, former Yugoslavia. From there, I moved to the World Bank Institute for 2 years, working on freedom of information and freedom of expression law, working with civil society partners to help advocate for new legislation in those areas. And then I worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace in the Technology, Media, and Peacebuilding Center, where I worked on programs in Iraq, Afghanistan, Myanmar, South Sudan. And then my team was spun off as a separate NGO called Peace Tech Lab. At that time, I was living in Kenya. So I started the regional office of Peace Tech Lab in Nairobi, working with local partners there on various media technology and peace building programs. I returned to the US, started working at a large international development NGO called FHI 360, where I met with you, and more recently have returned back at IREX in a more senior position. So that's the whole trajectory.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. That's very, very interesting. So a couple of questions come to mind before we wrap things up. The first, going back to your line of career leading up to where you are now. At any point, did you think about going into journalism? And if so, what pushed you in a different direction?
Right. Well, I in graduate school, I did take a number of communications classes, and I was thinking about foreign service. I was thinking about journalism at a certain point. But as I said, those internships during graduate school really directed me more towards the international development work, because I really did want to get some experience in the field, working in other countries. And I felt like that was my best option at that time for pursuing those interests.
That makes sense. And finally, given your experiences and what you know now, what advice can you give to current students on how to best prepare themselves for entry points into this career field or other related career fields?
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is sometimes you can't plan your full career path. It's often not linear. And so it can take you in different directions, and that's fine. That's not something to be worried about. That's definitely how my career took me, and at the time, at times it was intimidating, but I feel like I've ended up in a good spot, and so that's the first thing. The second thing is field experience in conflict transformation is critical. So the job market here in DC, for example, is quite polarized. There are a lot of positions at the entry level, and positions also centered in the more senior management levels, but not as much in between. So starting at the entry level, for example, as a college graduate and earning your spurs in an entry level position as a program assistant or as an intern, that's a great place to start. But then often you need to figure out how to leave that space, perhaps through work in the field or changing sectors even, in order to come back at a higher level position. That's something to take into account. And of course, this should be news to no one. Networking is so important. Meeting people in person. I know we're in a virtual world, but I still encourage meeting people in person, face to face, not 2D, 3D, and really making those connections, because literally every job that I've been able to get in the international development arena has been through those contacts and has been meeting people in person. So those would be some tips that I would offer.
Perfect. Well, Theo, thank you once again for your insights and for your engagement with us in helping students to prepare for their first career destinations.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
So in closing, I want to encourage the viewers to tune in to get career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in the series. I also want to encourage you to tune in to other MIDDVantage series, which could be accessed through the Events and Programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you for watching.